The message reached my inbox at 8:03 on a Monday morning. Subject: Organizational Efficiency Initiative. After almost 16 years in supply chain management, I had learned to recognize certain phrases. Companies rarely announced layoffs, restructures, or power shifts directly. Instead, they preferred words like efficiency, alignment, optimization, or modernization. Those words sounded positive. In reality, they usually meant someone had already made a decision that would affect dozens of people. I closed the email without replying and finished my coffee. My name is Daniel Foster. I'm 43 years old, and for the previous 6 years I had been regional operations manager for one of the largest industrial equipment distributors in the Midwest. On paper, my job looked straightforward. Manage inventory, coordinate warehouses, support sales, improve delivery performance. Reality was very different. Every shipment depended on dozens of decisions made by people who rarely worked in the same building. Purchasing teams negotiated with suppliers. Warehouse supervisors managed incoming freight. Drivers dealt with weather, traffic, damaged roads, and impossible schedules. Sales representatives promised delivery dates before checking inventory. When everything worked, nobody noticed. When one truck arrived late, suddenly everyone wanted answers. That was operations. People only remembered you when something went wrong. When I joined the company 6 years earlier, the business had serious operational problems. Inventory records were unreliable. Warehouses blamed purchasing. Purchasing blamed suppliers. Sales blamed operations. Customers blamed everyone. Nobody accepted responsibility because responsibility had become impossible to define. The previous vice president once told me something during my interview that stayed with me for years. We're losing money because people spend more time protecting themselves than solving problems. At the time, I thought he was exaggerating. He wasn't. During my first month, I realized that almost every department measured success differently. Sales wanted larger orders. Finance wanted lower inventory. Warehouse managers wanted fewer emergency shipments. Transportation wanted predictable schedules. Every department was achieving its own targets while making someone else's job harder. The company didn't have incompetent employees. It had disconnected priorities. Instead of introducing expensive software or hiring outside consultants, I started with something much simpler. Conversations. Every Tuesday morning, warehouse supervisors, purchasing managers, transportation coordinators, and customer service leads met for 30 minutes. No presentations. No PowerPoint slides. Just real operational issues. The first meetings were uncomfortable. People arrived ready to defend themselves. Instead, I asked everyone the same question. What is slowing your team down this week? Not who caused it. Not who deserved blame. Just what needed to be fixed. Something interesting happened after a few months. Departments stopped treating one another like competitors. They started calling each other before problems became emergencies. Warehouse managers shared inventory concerns before customers complained. Purchasing warned transportation about supplier delays days in advance. Sales finally understood why promising impossible delivery dates only created bigger problems later. None of these ideas were revolutionary. They were simply consistent. Within 2 years, late deliveries dropped by almost 30%. Emergency freight costs decreased. Customer complaints became less frequent. Employee turnover slowed. People trusted each other more because they understood each other's work. The board loved the numbers. Investors loved the quarterly reports. Senior executives loved talking about operational excellence during earnings calls. Ironically, that success attracted exactly the kind of attention I never wanted. Our CEO retired shortly after my 5th year. The replacement came from outside the industry. His name was Victor Reynolds. His resume looked impressive. Consulting, private equity, corporate transformation, rapid expansion. Every interview about his appointment described him as someone who challenged traditional thinking. Employees described him differently. Nobody knew him. Nobody knew how he made decisions. The first company-wide meeting felt more like a business school lecture than a conversation with employees. Victor spent nearly an hour discussing metrics, benchmarking, organizational leverage, scalable governance. Not once did he ask how our warehouses actually operated. Afterward, several managers gathered near the coffee machines. Nobody spoke for almost a minute. Finally, one warehouse director smiled. Did anyone understand what our actual strategy is? Nobody answered, because nobody could. A month later, consultants started appearing in every regional office. They carried tablets instead of notebooks. They rarely introduced themselves. They observed meetings, asked questions, requested reports, interviewed managers individually. Again, none of that worried me. External reviews happened every few years. Fresh perspectives could be useful. Then the questions changed. Instead of asking about inventory accuracy or delivery performance, they became interested in something else. Who approved overtime? Who decided staffing levels? Who employees trusted most? Which managers solved problems without involving executives? Who had worked at the company the longest? One afternoon, after another interview, our HR director quietly closed my office door. She looked uncomfortable. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Have they asked unusual questions during your interviews?" I nodded. "They seem less interested in operations than people." She sighed. "I've noticed the same thing." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question both of us were already thinking. "Do you think they're redesigning the company?" She looked toward the hallway before answering. "I think they're deciding who still fits inside it." That sentence stayed with me for days. Because once leadership starts evaluating influence instead of performance, experience often becomes a liability instead of an advantage. The first warning arrived quietly. Calendar invitations disappeared. Weekly leadership meetings continued without me. Regional planning sessions suddenly had different participant lists. Nobody explained why. At first I assumed it was an administrative mistake. Then department heads started calling afterward. "Daniel, why weren't you in today's planning review?" I wasn't invited. What? Half the discussion was about warehouse operations. I wish I could explain. Neither of us could. 3 weeks later, the company announced a new division, Operational Strategy Office. The official explanation sounded reasonable. The company needed stronger coordination between regions, better reporting, more standardized decision-making, more executive visibility. On paper, it sounded efficient. In practice, it created another layer between people doing the work and people approving it. The new director had never managed a warehouse. He had never negotiated with freight carriers. He had never handled emergency inventory shortages during peak season. His background was management consulting. Apparently, that was considered enough. Within 2 months, routine purchasing approvals that once required one manager now required 4 signatures. Warehouse supervisors spent more time filling spreadsheets than supervising employees. Transportation coordinators waited days for approvals that previously took minutes. Nobody complained publicly, but conversations changed. Employees stopped asking how to improve operations. They started asking how to survive them. And for the first time since joining the company, I had the uncomfortable feeling that we were no longer solving business problems. We were protecting a strategy that hadn't yet admitted it was failing. The first serious warning didn't come from a financial report. It came from one of our oldest warehouse supervisors. His name was Mark. He had worked for the company for nearly 28 years, longer than almost everyone at headquarters. Mark wasn't the kind of manager who complained often. If he called me directly instead of sending an email, I knew something important had happened. "Do you have 10 minutes?" he asked. "For you?" "Always." There was a long pause before he answered. "I think we're breaking the warehouse." That wasn't the kind of sentence you ignored. The following morning, I drove 2 hours to his facility. Nothing looked unusual from the outside. Trucks were arriving. Forklifts were moving pallets. Employees were scanning inventory. Business appeared normal. Inside, it was anything but normal. Mark walked me across the warehouse floor without saying much. Eventually, he stopped near the receiving area. "You see those trailers?" I counted 6. "They've been waiting since yesterday." "Why?" He handed me a printed approval form. A routine inventory transfer. The request itself took less than 5 minutes to complete. The approval process had taken 27 hours. I looked at him. "You're kidding." I wish I was. He wasn't angry. He sounded tired. That worried me more. Experienced managers rarely lose control because of one bad decision. They lose energy after hundreds of unnecessary ones. Over the next 3 weeks, similar stories arrived from every region. A shipment delayed because someone at headquarters questioned a freight classification. Replacement equipment waiting 3 days because a new reporting template hadn't been completed correctly. Warehouse managers spending entire afternoons in virtual meetings instead of supervising loading operations. Every new process claimed to improve accountability. Instead, it delayed execution. During one leadership meeting, I finally asked the question that had been bothering everyone. Has anyone measured how much additional time these approvals are adding? Silence. Several directors looked down at their laptops. Victor smiled politely. We're still in the adjustment phase. That answer sounded reasonable. It also avoided the question completely. After the meeting, our transportation manager caught up with me in the parking garage. She lowered her voice before speaking. Do you ever feel like nobody wants actual numbers anymore? What do you mean? They ask for reports every week. That's true, but they never discuss what's inside them. I thought about that during my drive home. She was right. Leadership requested more data than ever before. Yet fewer operational conversations actually happened. The reports had become the objective. The business itself had become secondary. A month later, customer complaints started increasing. At first, only slightly. One delayed shipment, then another. Several long-term clients began asking why delivery estimates kept changing. Customer service blamed logistics. Logistics blamed approvals. Approvals blamed documentation. Nobody was technically wrong. That was exactly the problem. Responsibility had become so fragmented that solving anything required permission from people who weren't involved in the original issue. One Friday afternoon, I received an email from a customer I'd known for almost 10 years. He wasn't angry, disappointed. Sometimes that's worse. Daniel, we've always trusted your company because someone would answer the phone and solve the problem. Lately, everyone tells us they're waiting for authorization. Is something changing? I stared at the message for several minutes. I wanted to tell him the truth. Instead, I apologized for the delay and promised to investigate. Deep down, I already knew the answer. The company hadn't become less capable. It had become less confident. People stopped making decisions because making the wrong decision carried more risk than making no decision at all. Fear spreads quietly inside organizations. It doesn't arrive through dramatic speeches. It appears in small moments. An employee decides not to approve a shipment without executive approval. A supervisor delays hiring because another signature might be required. A manager schedules another meeting instead of choosing a solution. Eventually, hesitation becomes normal. Around that time, another change was announced. Every regional manager would now submit weekly performance presentations directly to the Operational Strategy Office. Not summaries. Full presentations. 35 slides. Charts. Forecasts. Risk assessments. Improvement plans. Every single week. My operations analyst spent nearly 2 full days preparing those presentations. 2 days that had previously been spent solving customer issues. One afternoon, I asked her how long she had worked on the newest report. She checked her notes. Almost 14 hours. And how many people actually discussed it? She smiled without humor. As far as I know, none. That answer said more than any performance metric ever could. The breaking point came during a supplier emergency. One of our largest manufacturers experienced an unexpected production shutdown. Normally, regional managers could quickly redistribute inventory between warehouses to protect customer deliveries. We had done it dozens of times. This time, however, every transfer required approval from the new strategy office. By the time authorization arrived, 48 hours had passed. Several key customers received incomplete shipments. One canceled a purchase order worth nearly $900,000. Not because we lacked inventory, because we reacted too slowly. The following Monday, Victor held an executive review. His opening slide focused on customer satisfaction. The numbers had dropped. Revenue forecasts were revised downward. Delivery performance had reached its lowest point in 4 years. Everyone in the room already knew why. Still, nobody said it immediately. Finally, our finance director cleared his throat. I think we're making operations too complicated. Nobody interrupted him. Encouraged, he continued. We're measuring more. He looked around the room, but delivering less. For the first time since Victor became CEO, I noticed genuine discomfort on several executive faces. Not disagreement. Recognition. The numbers were beginning to tell the same story employees had been discussing privately for months. Unfortunately, organizations rarely change because workers identify problems. They usually change only after the financial reports make those problems impossible to ignore. And I had a growing suspicion that we hadn't reached the worst part of the story yet. The call came on a Wednesday evening, just after I had finished dinner. It was Lisa, our director of customer relations. She almost never called after business hours. Sorry to bother you. she said. But I think you should know what's happening. I walked into my home office and closed the door. Go ahead. We lost Henderson Manufacturing. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood. Henderson? The entire account. They had been our customer for almost 12 years. Their annual business represented several $1 million in revenue. We had survived supply shortages, transportation strikes, and even the pandemic together. I couldn't imagine them leaving over a single late shipment. What happened? Lisa sighed. It wasn't one shipment. It was everything. She explained that during the previous 3 months, Henderson's purchasing department had repeatedly requested simple adjustments to delivery schedules. Nothing unusual, the kind of requests we used to approve within an hour. Instead, every request had been forwarded through multiple approval levels. Responses arrived days later. Sometimes they contradicted each other. Sometimes nobody responded at all. Eventually, Henderson stopped asking. They started looking for another supplier. The decision wasn't emotional. It was practical. They simply couldn't run their factories while waiting for us to make up our minds. After we ended the call, I sat in silence for a long time. Customers rarely leave because of one mistake. They leave after dozens of small disappointments. The next morning, I drove to headquarters for our quarterly leadership conference. Normally, those meetings focused on planning inventory, forecasting demand, and preparing for the next quarter. This time, the atmosphere felt completely different. People spoke quietly. The usual conversations before the meeting barely existed. Everyone had seen the latest performance reports. Nobody expected good news. Victor entered the conference room exactly at 9. He thanked everyone for their hard work. He praised our commitment during a challenging transition. Then the finance department presented the numbers. Revenue was below forecast. Warehouse productivity had fallen. Customer retention was slipping. Overtime costs had increased dramatically. The graphs told a story nobody wanted to hear. When the presentation ended, Victor looked around the room. What are we missing? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, I raised my hand. I think we're measuring activity instead of results. Every head turned toward me. Victor nodded. What do you mean? We've added reports, approvals, committees, presentations. But customers don't pay us for internal processes. They pay us to solve problems. The room became very quiet. For a second, I thought someone would interrupt. Nobody did. I continued. Our regional teams know how to do their jobs. They've proven it for years. But we've created a system where experienced managers are afraid to make routine decisions. One vice president leaned forward. Do you have evidence? I opened my laptop. I brought some. During the previous month, I had compared operational data from before and after the restructuring. The differences were impossible to ignore. Average approval times had increased by more than 300%. Emergency inventory transfers took nearly 4 times longer. Warehouse supervisors spent almost 40% more time on administrative work. Customer response times had doubled. Meanwhile, actual operational performance had declined almost everywhere. Nobody questioned the numbers. They came directly from our own reporting system. Ironically, the reports that leadership loved so much had become evidence against their own strategy. Victor studied the charts carefully. Then he looked toward the director of the operational strategy office. Is this accurate? He adjusted his glasses before answering. The numbers appear correct. Appear. Not are. Appear. Even then, nobody wanted to admit what everyone already understood. The discussion lasted nearly 3 hours. Some executives defended the restructuring. Others argued that employees simply needed more time to adapt. But every explanation eventually ran into the same obstacle. Reality. The data showed that almost every operational metric had deteriorated after decision-making became centralized. Around lunchtime, the meeting ended without any clear conclusion. As people gathered their laptops, our chief financial officer quietly approached me. Walk with me. We stopped near the large windows overlooking the distribution yard. Forklifts moved below us. Trucks waited at loading docks. Business continued despite everything happening upstairs. He folded his arms. I've been reviewing our numbers every night. And I think we've been asking the wrong questions. What do you mean? We keep asking why employees aren't performing. He looked outside. When maybe we should be asking why we've made it so difficult for them to perform. That was the first honest conversation I'd had with an executive in months. For the first time, I believed someone at the top was beginning to understand. Unfortunately, understanding a mistake and correcting it are two very different things. 2 weeks later, another email appeared in my inbox. This one contained no subject line, just a meeting invitation, mandatory attendance, human resources included, 30 minutes, no agenda. I didn't need anyone to explain what that usually meant. After 16 years in corporate operations, I'd seen enough reorganizations to recognize the pattern. When meetings include HR, but no explanation, the decision has almost always been made before you walk into the room. Still, I showed up on time. Victor was already there. So was our HR director. Neither smiled. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. Almost 6 years of rebuilding regional operations. Reduced to 22 minutes. Victor spoke first. The company is moving in a different strategic direction. HR explained that my position was being eliminated as part of another organizational redesign. Officially, it had nothing to do with my performance. The paperwork made that very clear. Corporate language has an incredible talent for making life-changing decisions sound administrative. I listened without interrupting, asked a few practical questions, collected the documents, shook their hands. Then I walked out. The hardest part wasn't losing the title. It was realizing that the people making the decision still believed they were fixing the company. They honestly couldn't see that they had become the problem. As I packed my office over the next few days, managers stopped by one after another. Some were angry. Some were confused. Others simply wanted to say goodbye. Mark arrived on my final afternoon. He looked around the nearly empty office before speaking. You know what worries me most? What? They're getting rid of people who understand the business. He paused. But they still think they're protecting it. I didn't have an answer, because deep down, I feared he was absolutely right. The first week after leaving the company felt strangely quiet. For 6 years my phone had started ringing before 7 every morning. Suppliers, warehouse managers, sales directors, customers. There was always another problem waiting to be solved. Now the mornings were silent. At first, I wasn't sure whether to enjoy it or worry about it. I updated my resume, spoke with a few recruiters, and tried not to think too much about my former employer. That lasted exactly 12 days. Mark called first. They've changed the approval process again. What happened this time? Now every inventory exception has to be reviewed by headquarters. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because I genuinely didn't know how else to react. How long does that take? The fastest one so far was 18 hours. And the longest? For days. I closed my eyes. Some products we distributed were replacement components for manufacturing equipment. When a customer's production line stopped because of a failed component, they didn't have 4 days. Sometimes they didn't even have 4 hours. Over the following month, more former colleagues reached out. Lisa, our transportation manager, several warehouse supervisors, even 2 sales directors. Every conversation sounded different, but they all described the same problem. Nobody trusted their own authority anymore. Managers who had spent decades making operational decisions now forwarded simple questions to executives. Executives requested more reports before approving anything. The reports generated more questions. Those questions produced more meetings. By the time someone finally approved a solution, the original problem had usually become much larger. One afternoon, Lisa called again. We lost another major customer. I wasn't even surprised. What happened? They said dealing with us had become exhausting. Those words stayed with me. Not expensive, not unreliable, exhausting. That might have been the most accurate description of the entire organization. Customers don't enjoy explaining the same issue to 5 different people. They don't enjoy waiting 3 days for someone to approve an obvious decision. Eventually, they stop asking. They simply leave. About 2 months after my departure, I accepted a position with another industrial distributor. It was smaller. The salary was slightly lower. The title sounded less impressive. But during my interview, the company's president said something that immediately caught my attention. I don't hire managers to ask me permission. I hire them to solve problems. That single sentence told me more about the company than any annual report could. My first weeks there felt almost unreal. Warehouse supervisors made decisions without scheduling meetings. Regional managers called each other directly instead of sending formal requests through 3 departments. Customer complaints were handled the same day whenever possible. The business wasn't perfect. No company is. But people trusted one another. That trust made everything move faster. 3 months later, I received an unexpected email. The sender was our former chief financial officer. The subject line contained only 3 words. Can we talk? We arranged a video call for Friday afternoon. The moment he appeared on screen, I could tell he looked exhausted. Not physically, mentally. The kind of exhaustion that comes from watching problems grow while knowing exactly why they're happening. After a few minutes of small talk, he shared his screen. Revenue had continued to decline. Employee turnover had reached its highest level in company history. Several experienced warehouse managers had resigned. 2 regional directors had accepted positions with competitors. Customer retention had fallen for 4 consecutive quarters. He looked at me. I wanted to ask you something. Go ahead. When did you realize we weren't dealing with temporary growing pains? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked at the charts. Then I said something I'd been thinking for months. The day experienced employees became obstacles instead of resources. He nodded slowly. I was afraid you'd say that. For the next hour, we talked about operations. Not personalities. Not office politics. Just operations. Every issue eventually led to the same conclusion. The company had confused control with leadership. Those aren't the same thing. Control slows decisions. Leadership improves them. Control demands permission. Leadership develops judgment. The more we talked, the clearer one lesson became. The company had never suffered from a lack of intelligent employees. It suffered from a lack of trust. Without trust, people protect themselves. They stop taking initiative. They stop accepting responsibility. Eventually, they stop caring altogether. Near the end of our conversation, he asked one final question. If you could give one piece of advice to every executive, what would it be? I didn't need time to think. Spend 1 week doing the work before redesigning it. He smiled for the first time during the call. I wish someone had done that. We never spoke again. A few months later, I heard through former colleagues that Victor had resigned. Officially, it was described as a mutual decision. Unofficially, everyone knew the board had finally run out of patience. The company eventually removed most of the approval layers. Regional managers regained authority. Warehouse supervisors were allowed to solve routine problems again. Some customers returned. Many didn't. Trust takes years to build and only months to destroy. That lesson is expensive. Sometimes impossibly expensive. People occasionally ask whether I regret losing that job. For a long time, I thought I did. Now my answer is different. I regret believing that good results are enough to protect your career. They're not. If leadership values appearances more than execution, performance eventually becomes irrelevant. The people closest to the work usually recognize problems first. Ignoring them doesn't make those problems disappear. It only delays the moment when everyone else notices. If there's one thing I hope younger managers learn from my experience, it's this. Never assume that the people making the biggest decisions understand the daily reality of the business. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. When they stop listening to the employees who actually keep the company running, decline rarely begins with one catastrophic mistake. It begins with dozens of small decisions that seem harmless on their own. One unnecessary approval. One delayed shipment. One experienced employee who decides it's no longer worth speaking up. Then another. And another. By the time the financial reports reveal the truth, the culture has already changed. The customers have already noticed. The best employees have already started leaving. Looking back, losing that position wasn't the hardest part of my career. Watching a successful company slowly undermine itself was. Because the collapse wasn't caused by bad people. It was caused by good people who became so focused on controlling the business that they stopped paying attention to how the business actually worked. And that's a mistake I hope I never make, no matter what title I hold in the future.